So today I felt like being a little bit productive, and I know that a few of my friends and my mother have asked me multiple times for recipes for stuff, so I figured I'd just throw a recipe on here, because why not? Because we're all bored and we're at home and we have time to do things like this. So today I decided I'm making meatballs. So there's a few different ways that I do this. One way is I'll stuff a cube of cheese inside the middle. So if you have some cheese that you like that usually goes with spaghetti and meatballs, or however you like to eat meatballs, you're more than welcome to do that. I, however, have not been able to find some because we are in quarantine, and I usually like to go hunt it down. So since I do not have that, we're going to just go with what we already have in the kitchen. So first things first, I have my ground beef. If you are more into tofu, I'm sure that it'll work too. I do have tofu in the kitchen. I'm a red meat person. That tofu I usually use for a stir fry. Anyway, meatballs. So when you're going to do something like this, something that I always do is I'll either make it the day that I buy the meat, so that way it's a little bit less frozen. So it's nice and cool because they keep it in a refrigerated area, but it's not frozen through, which is really nice. This, however, I've bought this meat a while ago, and I usually keep it in the freezer. So I put this in the fridge yesterday so that it would thaw out, but it wouldn't go bad because it wouldn't keep it out in room temperature, because if you're doing that, it's bad and bacteria can grow in there. Anyway, so I have it here, and it is a little broken up, and we're gonna start adding all of the ingredients. So I just kind of throw it all together and then I mix it. I'm gonna try to share as many tricks as I can. I'm gonna try to number them, but I'll forget. One thing that I do before I stick my hands in the meat, I will prep it. So if you don't like to put meat on your hands, you're more than welcome to wear gloves. Just make sure that they are food safe and aren't being used for anything else. So before I stick my hands in there, I like to make sure I put all of my ingredients in there, so all of the seasonings that I'm going to mix in there and everything like that, and make sure that once I start touching the meat, I'm not going to be touching anything else, and there's nothing else that I will need to touch. That being said, I still make mistakes, so I always like to keep something like Clorox wipes or a cleaning spray on hand so that I can wipe down everything that I've touched. Another thing that I do before I touch the meat is I try to start the water running. So on the sink, so I don't have to start touching stuff. I just already have the water running, and I can just pump some soap in my hand and start scrubbing, and it should be all good. So let's get started. So I usually use the sirloin beef. It's got a lot less fat in it, and we just prefer it. I use a whole pound pack, more or less. It's give or take, but it's about a pound of meat. I try not to defrost it beforehand because it can cook it through a little bit. I'd like to just defrost it overnight so that way it's still very raw and I can cook it fairly evenly. I will throw in all of my dry ingredients. So I use a garlic salt instead of just a regular salt because I like the flavor that the garlic salt adds to it. I'm gonna just sprinkle that in there. I just like to coat it 2 or 3 times. It's a thing that I learned from my mom. She would just like sprinkle a layer on. For me, it's like sprinkled 3 layers on. So I go 1, 2, and 3. Because my husband really likes fresh ground pepper, I've started to use it a lot more. So we're just gonna crank some in there. Now, if you're a person that doesn't usually do a lot of spices in your food and you don't know like how to do it, I count by like layers of it. So like the garlic salt is very white, so you can see like a layer going on. And I'll just try to do an even 2-3 coats of it. With the pepper, you don't have that much of an option if it's fresh ground pepper. If it's already ground pepper, it's not a big deal. It's still gonna be good. You can just sprinkle on a layer or 2 depending on how much pepper you want. After a certain point, pepper is gonna get spicy on you because of how much you put in it. So I just like to put a couple cranks in there. And then I invested in a spice rack because I finally decided enough was enough. So I'm gonna start with some Italian seasoning, and it's a blend of a few different spices, and it makes it a lot easier for me to remember what I put in it. So I will start with this. If you want to look up later what's in Italian seasoning, it's pretty easy to find. It's usually like parsley, it's usually like oregano, things like that. And it keeps it fairly evenly blended, so I don't have to worry about putting a little bit too much of any single one. So again, I'm just gonna go in there and put like, I don't know, 2 or 3 layers of it. I just start shaking. I don't measure. I've never measured. I feel like it might be a thing that my family does because I've never seen any of my family measure. The only time we ever measure is when we're trying a recipe that somebody gave us or we bought a cookbook. Is what it is. And okay, next. So I also like to add in some basil. It's dried basil. If I have fresh basil on hand, I will throw that in there. But being stuck in, you know, stay-at-home orders and all of that, I ran out. I tried to use it within a week of buying it because then it starts to go bad. So I did use it. It didn't go to waste, but now I just don't have fresh basil on hand. So dried basil will work. It's not going to have quite the same flavor profile because it's been dried, but it's still going to be really good. And I really like that flavor. So I'm going to sprinkle some more in there. Now, if you look up Italian seasoning, and I don't know off the top of my head what is in it, if it says that it has basil already in there, you're more than welcome not to put more basil, but personally, I really like the basil flavor. So I always put a little more. Alrighty, what next? Okay, so here are my specific things that I always do because I feel like it does a really good job. So I have these Italian breadcrumbs that I will sprinkle in there, and I will do quite a bit of it. So I'd say maybe like a 1/4 cup to a 1/2 cup, depending on exactly how much meat is in there. I think it keeps it together really well and it tastes really good, and it adds a little bit more of that crispiness and crunch to it because it is bread. So it might be a really good thing to try. And an egg. I always put egg in it because if you look at any recipe that includes breading, that includes, well, primarily breading, but like keeping things together, egg is really good about it. Like it's liquid, you can mix it in really well, and once it starts to cook, it holds stuff together a little bit better. Now, I only use 1 egg for a pound, so if you're gonna do less, you might not want to do a whole egg, and you can just whisk it on the side, put 1/2, 1/4, like however much you think should go in there. It shouldn't change the consistency. If you're gonna do a lot more, you might wanna use more eggs. It's really just as a binder to kind of keep it all together. I don't whisk it beforehand. I probably should, I just don't. I'll just crack it in there and mix it as I go, and it's not a super big deal for me, but I also mix it really thoroughly. I like to make sure that it's evenly blended, especially with the spices, because when we put it in, and I can show you, it creates that layer on top of it, and then just as the chunk fell off, they've got spots that don't have any spice on it. So if you don't mix it really thoroughly, you're going to get bland spots, and that's not what we want. So, going in with the breadcrumbs. It doesn't have, it's an open pour, so it doesn't have like little holes in it to make it a little bit less pour, so it's a pretty heavy pour. And I do about 2 layers just to get a good amount of breadcrumbs in there. So about like a 1/4 cup would be good. And then the egg. And so right around this point is when usually I'll start mixing it together, get it all together, and then I'll start forming the meatballs. And like I mentioned before, I always put cheese in the middle, but again, since I don't have it, I'm gonna use an Italian blend cheese package. Now you don't have to put cheese in your meatballs if you don't want to. You can always like do Parmesan on top, which I also have Parmesan and I was gonna use, but we're running low, so I'm improvising. Anyway. So you don't wanna put too much of this because you don't want it to be all ooey gooey all over, unless that's what you're aiming for. Kudos to you, you do that. But I'm gonna do about, I'd say like a 1/2 cup, if not a 1/4 cup, a 1/3 cup. A 1/3 cup of cheese. That's what it looks like. Just enough to like put some cheese in it so that it's a little bit cheesier. In our family, we really like cheese. I have become a cheese lover because my husband loves it so much. But I always try to put cheese inside of our foods. It's not going to taste that different if you don't put it in there, so it's not a big deal if you don't like cheese. Don't put it in there. We move on. And like I mentioned, if you have the cube cheeses, I'll let you know when we're going to put that in later, so if you have that, you don't have to worry about it for now. And you can use Italian cheese blend. You can use the Parmesan. When I was growing up, we always had like a big little like shaker of Parmesan, and you can just put like a 1/2 cup in there. It's a little bit easier. This is a little bit of a wetter cheese, so it's going to have a slightly different consistency versus the powdered grated cheese that's gonna mix easier, so you can put more of it there. You can always put more of this later. Sometimes, depending how I cook it, I'll add a little cheese on top just to melt it on top of it to give it a nice little look. Okay, so now that I've got that done, I'm gonna start the water. So that way I have that running and I can wash my hands as soon as I'm done. Another thing, make sure that you have a brush for your nails if you're gonna go ahead and just do it by hand, because like I have a little bit longer nails. I have a nail brush to make sure to get all of that in there. And I always take my ring off when I do this because I am not going to be scraping raw meat out of my wedding ring. Sorry. I do have another band that I can usually put on, but I forgot to go get it before I started filming, so I'm just not gonna worry about it today. It's fine. It doesn't change that I'm married. Alrighty. I think it's good to go. And now, if you don't want to do it by hand, you can use a spatula. If you don't mind doing it by hand, or you want to do it with gloves on, however you do, just make sure that whatever you're using is food safe. Like, don't just go get a stick outside and start mixing it. Okay. First thing I usually do is I'll stick my hand into the egg so I can break up that yolk, because otherwise it'll just like find a way to like roll around. It always does. I'm not quite sure how. If I don't do that, it'll just somehow remain intact until the very end, and I'm just like, all right, I gotta break up this yolk. Cooking is one of my favorite things to do because it keeps my mind off of what's going on in the world, and especially right now, it's been a really great thing to be able to do. All right, so this meat is still really cold, so I'm gonna go ahead and just stick it under the water to kind of give some feeling back into my fingers. Now, if you are somebody like me who likes to put their dishes into the sink, you know, when they're dirty, that's fine, but please make sure that you're going to wash your dishes, or at least take them out of the sink before you do this, because then you're gonna get raw meat and all of your ingredients all over it, and that's not something that you wanna worry about later, being like, did I get it all? Okay, so now that we have it fairly thoroughly mixed, you can see it's a little bit more even. You can use a scooper, you can use like a spoon, a big spoon, however you feel. I just kind of do them by hand, because personally I hate doing dishes, so I try to make as little mess as possible. And for me, that's not getting a scooper, it's just using my hand. But if you're gonna use a scooper, feel free. Now, this is where that you're going to need your cheese if you're gonna be putting cubes in it. If you haven't already, wash your hands and come back to it, open it up. I always open it beforehand and lay out the cheese cubes on like a surface, so that way you're not trying to open the container with dirty hands that just touched raw meat. So have them ready to go. If they're not ready to go and you're just following along as we go, it's not a big deal. Wash your hands, come back. Anyway, so one of the things about meatballs that I notice is that people have a tendency to want to make really big meatballs. Now that's great, but you have to realize that because of it, it's going to want to cook very unevenly. So I always try to make fairly small meatballs, and I'm gonna go ahead and, I don't know, I'd say maybe it's about 1.5 to 2 inches. And that's your meatball. So if you're going to put cheese in it, what you're gonna do is you're gonna put it in your palm, or in the scoop, however you're gonna do it, and I just press it down, and then I just put the cube in there, and you fold it over, and you just cover it up, like you would be working with like bread or a dumpling. So I personally, like, when you were little, you played with Play-Doh and you try to make a ball, you gotta roll it around. That's what I do. I pinch a little bit, I put it in my hands, and we have our meatball. Now these I plan to bake later. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get it and I'm gonna put it on a square pan that I have. Now when you're going to bake them, you can either bake them or you can pan fry them, which is what I usually do, and I might still do it later, but I'm gonna store them at least in this for now. So make sure that wherever and however you put them, they have room to like kind of cook. So right now I'm gonna put them all like lined up really neatly all together, but once I am actually gonna cook them, I'm going to make sure that they have enough room between each other. And there's plenty of different ways that you can make them. When you bake them, if you're gonna just bake them like that and it's gonna be like a little snack that you wanna give to people that is just like little meatballs, that's great. You don't have to put anything on them. Sometimes you can, like, I'll drizzle some olive oil on them and just bake them like that. Personally, whenever I make meatballs, I always want to eat them with spaghetti because I'm a big pasta fiend. So what I'll do is either on the pan or in the oven, I will do like put them in a circle with a couple in the middle so that way they're really nicely spaced out. And I will fry them for a little bit, just like let them cook on one side, and while they're cooking on medium heat, I will start making my sauce. So I always add a bunch of stuff to my sauce. I start off, I'm always gonna add ragu to it or prego or whatever I feel like using at that point. So don't feel bad if you're just gonna use canned sauce, like just throw it in there, it's fine. It's whatever your taste preference is. There's a lot of meat in here, so making meatballs is gonna take a while. Alright. So what I'll do is I'll prep my sauce however I'm gonna prep it. And as it's cooking, I'll pour it in there. So that way it kind of bakes in the sauce a little bit because I really like that flavor. Now once you cook this meat, you can still store it. So if you want to just bake meatballs like that, like take a couple of them out for a snack and then freeze them and like thaw them out later, or put them in the fridge in a Ziploc bag or in a Tupperware container, whatever your preference is, and heat it up later, that's also fine. I'll make sure that I mention, just make sure that they are thoroughly cooked through, either by using a food thermometer or by cracking one open. And if you're gonna do the cracking one open style, don't pick the smallest one because it's going to cook the fastest, and if it's cooked, great. But that doesn't mean that the biggest one is going to be cooked through. So always pick the biggest meatball that you're going to test, crack it open and be like, all right, that one's cooked all the way through. But also remember that it is still red meat, so as long as it reaches cooking temp, it should be fine. If you know more about food safety than I do, feel free to drop a comment in there. I always just say make sure that it's cooked all the way through because it's just the safest option. You make sure that everything is good and killed in it, and you're also making sure that your meat is still good. Like if there's something growing on it, obviously don't use it. If it's expired, don't use it. All of the usual safety things. All right. Personally, I always eat my steaks medium rare. So if it's still a little pink, it's not a big deal. The same way like when you have a hamburger, if you like it medium and it's still a little pink in the middle and you're okay with that, it's a personal preference and choice. Just make sure that you're being safe when you're cooking food. Okay. I'm reaching the end of my meatballs. So when you're gonna cook them on the oven, I always put it to about 350 and I leave it there for 20 to 30 minutes. That's my usual go-to when I'm cooking something, and I just estimate from there. When I'm making lasagna, 350, and it's usually 40 minutes for a lasagna, but I always start at 350 and go from there. I feel like it's the most common temperature that I personally use and that I've seen when I look at recipes. It's not scientific or anything. It's not oh, this is guaranteed to work. It's no, that's just my safe point of starting, because that's just how I've always made them. Don't be worried if you are at the end or you're at your last meatball and it's too big and you just want to take a little bit off, but then you're like, oh, well, I can't make a whole meatball with the last bits. Don't worry about it. In my experience, you always have a small meatball and you can just add it to that one. Or you can just make a baby meatball and it's not a big deal either. Your meatballs don't have to be perfect, they just have to be yummy. And if they're not yummy, well, you tried and you can try again. Alright, so I'm just adding my last bits like I mentioned. There's always a small meatball, so I'm just adding them to my baby meatballs so that I can even them out. I always have this weird transition where I start with one really good sized meatball and I'm like, oh, I got this. And then they get smaller and then they get bigger because I'm running, going to the end of my ground beef, and I'm like, oh, okay, I gotta finish this, and then yeah. So I always have weirdly uneven meatballs, so don't worry about it. If you're going to put them in a skillet, what I always remember to do is to flip them over. I just finished with all of my meatballs, and I will show them to you in just a minute, but I need to wash my hands first because I was just handling raw meat, and I'm not gonna put that all over my phone. And especially considering that the coronavirus has taught all of us how to hand wash properly, I'm not going to walk you through that. But do make sure that you wash your hands correctly, and that when you look at them, there's no little chunks of raw meat or spices on your fingers or under your nails, because that's how bacteria can start growing. Got to make sure that you're all clean. And I always keep a towel on hand to dry them afterwards. Okay. So even though I kept all of my meat contained into the bowl, I'm still going to wipe down all of the surface and anything that might have had anything drop on it. Because I try to be careful, but even being careful, it doesn't always work. All right, so those are my meatballs. So when you're cooking them in the oven, like I mentioned, 350, just keep an eye on them. If you're going to do a food thermometer, like I have one here, open it up, turn it on. Make sure that you don't just like, when you stick it into the meatball, you don't just like stick it into a little bit. You got to make sure it's all the way through so it gets the entire temperature. But you also don't want to peek it off the other end, because if it starts touching the pan, it might give you a false reading. Okay. If you're going to do it in a skillet, which is how I usually do it, like I mentioned, I put them in a circle around the edge so that I have some room to move around. And I always do a circle because I'm starting to cook stuff in the middle. So when I do my own sauce, I'll put mushrooms, I'll put onions, I'll put garlic, I'll put tomatoes in it, I'll put fresh basil if I have it, and just toss it together till everything's really nice and sauteed and cooked really well, and like it looks like it's blending really nicely. And then I'll throw in some spaghetti sauce, whichever one I prefer. I usually do I want to say it's ragu. Yeah. I gotta go check because I don't remember brand names. It's ragu. It's the like chunky garlic and mushrooms or something like that. It's a blend. I like chunks in my sauce, which is why I add more chunks. But right now we have traditional just because that's what they had when we did our last grocery shopping trip. And those are meatballs. Once I get all the sauce going and everything cooking in them, when you're in the skillet, make sure to flip them over. When in the oven, it's not as big a deal because they're going to be surrounded by heat and it's going to be cooking top to bottom, and it should be fine. But if you still feel like flipping over, because it is going to give like a little bit of a burnt sear, however you want to describe it, on the bottom that's touching the pan, feel free to flip them over. Use tongs, be safe. And that's that. If you're going to try it, please let me know because I'm curious to see how it comes out. Leave a comment, send me a message, however you want to do that. If you have questions because I was not specific, or I just didn't show you how much I was putting in there, or you want specific measurements, I can't give you specific measurements, but I will try to give you specific measurements. Or if you want to try something new, or you tried something new, let me know. I'm always game to try new stuff. And these are going to be delicious, and I'm staring at them and I'm really excited to see how these come out because I've not done it with Italian cheese blend mixed into it, but I'm sure it's going to be great. So that's all I have for today. Hopefully it gave you a little something to do, and I will probably start trying to do this whenever I try something cool that people always ask me recipes on. And maybe it'll just be our Friday thing, our Friday recipe thing. It'll be fun. And maybe when this quarantine is over, I'll still do it. And you'll see my husband walking around the background trying to figure out how to help me while simultaneously getting in my way, because that's how our kitchen routine works. Thanks for watching.